Hi, everyone. Welcome. As we're giving people a chance to get their technology connected, will we wait just a couple more seconds so people can join? But feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know where you're calling in from. We always love to see where people are joining from. So we'll start in just another less than a minute. Well, hopefully everybody's audio is connected. If folks join us late, that's okay. I'll talk for a little bit so they won't miss the heart of the film screening. Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today for the first of our two-part series of webinars around the topic of child detention. My name is Sarah Sturm. I'm on the Telos team, and I'm speaking today from Washington, D.C. For those of you who are joining us at a Telos event for the first time, the Telos Group's an American nonprofit based in DC, and our mission is to form communities of peacemakers across lines of difference and equip them to reconcile seemingly intractable conflict at home and abroad. Our topic today is child detention, and we're lucky enough to have Priscilla Wathington joining us to share more about what this practice is and why it's so harmful. Priscilla is a Palestinian American poet and human rights advocate who's worked with international and local West Bank NGOs, such as War Child Holland, the Norwegian Refugee Council, and Defense for Children International Palestine. Her debut poetry chapbook, Paper and Stick, which reckons with Israel's militarized permit regime over Palestinian family life, is forthcoming in October 2021. So today we're going to start by showing a short film titled Obaida, before Priscilla shares her insights around this topic. Throughout, if you have questions, please put them in the chat and I'll try to integrate them into our conversation. Before we jump right into the film, I want to share a few thoughts from Telos about why child detention is an important issue to engage, starting by reminding us of a couple of our principles and practices of peacemaking, one of which is mutual flourishing. Our end goal, or telos, is mutual flourishing, and Israel-Palestine, that means freedom, dignity, and security for Palestinians and Israelis in equal measure. Peacemaking is the dangerous, difficult, and joyous practice of channeling our righteous anger and demands for justice into the inclusive work of healing, mutual flourishing, and reconciliation. So today we're focusing on one pretty major issue of injustice that keeps there from being Palestinian flourishing. The other two practices I invite you to join me in today are listening to understand and centering the leadership of the marginalized. Before we can hope to heal our world, we must first learn to see it how it actually is. And being near or proximate to some of the most vulnerable and listening to community-based leaders are essential foundations of effective ethical movements. And those who pay the greatest price of unjust systems often have unique perspectives on how to transform them. So with those thoughts in mind, and without further ado, we'll watch Obaida and then we'll hear from Priscilla. So David, if you want to cue up the film, and everyone else can keep themselves on mute. It's a film that's about 7 minutes long, and then we'll all come right back together. Welcome back, everyone. I know that can be a really heavy video and a really hard topic to watch and learn about. But it's one that's really important that we pay attention to. So I'd love to bring in Priscilla now. And Priscilla, have you share just a little bit more about why Obaida the film was created, how you got involved in this issue, and why it's important that we pay attention to it?
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me here. And thank you for your careful attention to all these different things happening. So in 2018, I was the managing editor for Defense for Children International Palestine, who we're referring to as DCIP. As a bit of context, DCIP provides direct services through free legal aid to Palestinian children who are in the Israeli military court system, and also to Palestinian juveniles who are inside the Palestinian juvenile justice system. So whether they're arrested by Israeli forces or Palestinian forces, it works to limit incarceration periods and just generally get children out of that custody situation as fast as possible. So that's on the direct services side. And then on the documentation and advocacy side, DCIP works to expose these really grave human rights violations taking place, including fatalities, your injuries, torture, and other cruel or inhuman or degrading treatment that's taking place. I think that's really important because it's not enough to just go in and deliver the aid during a crisis. We really need to work towards long-term solutions and to holding perpetrators of these crimes accountable for their behaviors. I don't think there's any other way to advance access to justice for Palestinian children. So just within that kind of framework of what DCIP's work was, my job specifically was to be an advocate through text and through multimedia storytelling to kind of figure out, like, how do we grow this human rights movement, and how do we push forward the campaign, No Way to Treat a Child, which you're gonna hear about more in the future. But just to briefly say, it's a campaign that's calling on lawmakers in the US and in other places to speak out about Palestinian children who are stuck and trapped in this military detention system. And also, as a child rights organization, it was really important to us that we didn't just have like these experts speaking on behalf of children, but that children themselves had a way of telling their own stories in their own way, and especially those who had been really impacted by the system in place. So yeah, so we came to this plan as part of our film work. We wanted to do a documentary about a child who had been arrested multiple times and whose arrest experience demonstrated a lot of the structural patterns of ill treatment and abuse that the Israeli military carries out. So in other words, we weren't looking for a child in this particular case who was having this rare and uncommon experience. For example, like a child who had had the longest period of solitary confinement in a decade. I mean, we certainly covered those issues too. But in this case, we were looking for a child whose arrest experience really kind of told this larger story of like, what's the really typical scenario? What's the really frequent repeating patterns of abuse that you could expect if you were arrested? So in other words, like a typical case. And Obaida was one of those kids. At the same time, I do want to be really clear and say that while his experience made him like this one in a long list framing to his friends, to his family, to people who knew him, he was an individual, he was singular, he was irreplaceable, he was beloved. So I never actually had the chance to meet Obaida in person. I met him through his story. And he made a really big impression on me because first, his smile, he just had this sort of shining spirit that came through. I think you can see it for yourself when you watch the film. There was something kind of miraculous about his joy, his tenderness after all he had been through. And he also was a person who wanted to tell his own story on his own terms. So we were very lucky to find Matthew Castle, who's an amazing filmmaker, willing to come and work with us and work on this film so that Obaida's story could be told, and also so that we could sort of use his story as an entry point, telling the story of many other children who'd been in a similar circumstance.
Yeah, Priscilla, the point you make about remembering to hold all of these children and individual narratives in their individual complexity, because those are kids and families and unique circumstances, is really important, even as we talk about this as being a bigger, structural systemic issue. Before we turn to more of a conversation about the role of film and art in tackling some of these themes, I'd appreciate if you could give us an update on what happened to Obaida. Unfortunately, it's a pretty sad update and not one that would be as hopeful as we would like.
Yeah, so when we started working with Obaida on the film, as you know, from like where you kind of are at the timeline of the film, he had been arrested twice. His life had been derailed in some ways, and yet in other ways, he was really finding his own path. He was owning his life, and he was making a lot of positive steps to engage with the reality as it was for him. It was a really tremendous shock to learn in May of 2021, this year, that he was killed by Israeli forces. And it was just a few weeks before he would have turned 18 and before he would have graduated from cooking school. So he was doing like a vocational sort of high school sort of aged program, the agricultural one that you see in the film. And then he went on to do this cooking program. So his life was really kind of about to hit its stride when this terrible event happens on May 17th. He is struck by a bullet around 8 p.m. in Arub refugee camp where he lived, which is in the south. For those of you who know a little bit of the West Bank, sort of near Hebron. There were demonstrations taking place at the time near the entrance to the camp, which is located near Route 60, that same road that you see him crossing in the film. And, you know, if you remember, that was a time that was very tumultuous. There were demonstrations taking place all across the West Bank because Israel was at the time bombarding the Gaza Strip between May 10th and May 21. During this 11-day period, 256 Palestinians were killed in Gaza and another 2,000 were injured. So Palestinians in the West Bank were protesting, they were grieving, they were trying to stand in solidarity and against these bombings. So, you know, Obaida was one of those people demonstrating, and a soldier who was maybe 200 feet or so away from him shot him, according to the eyewitness interviews that DCIP collected. And we also know that they went on to block an ambulance as it was trying to reach him, and he didn't survive. He died that day. We don't know too much more than that about his death, but we do know that under international law, it's lethal force is only permitted in situations where there's this direct threat present, either a direct threat to life or a direct threat of serious injury. And we do know that in other circumstances, Israeli forces have killed and shot Palestinian children in circumstances that did not rise to that definition of international law.
I appreciate the update, Priscilla. And one of the things that strikes me about Obaida's bigger story and his, you know, his whole life picture, not just the story told in the film, is that, again, holding that tension between this was his story and his individual experience. And there are so many different ways that he also shows the bigger structural issues that Palestinians face. And we're only focusing today on military detention, but there would have been so many other issues we could have talked about based on his experiences and life story. And I want to acknowledge before I ask this next question that this is a really heavy topic to talk about, to share about, communicate about, process. And I'd love to have you share more about the role of art in tackling and communicating traumatic stories, both through film and through your forthcoming poetry book, Paper and Stick, and to give you the opportunity to share a little bit more about what that has meant for you, how those mediums help you communicate these in a way that is, you know, not just heavy, but also helpful for us to be able to hear as you share more about this issue.
Thank you so much for that question. It's not an easy one to like just distill quickly, but it's important. I think, you know, and it's like a central question of like, how do we speak to people? How do we communicate? How do we connect? I think facts and statistics are really important, and I'm not going to in any way say they're not like absolutely critical to telling the story. I think in addition, though, there is this human thing, which is something that's beyond just the numbers, the list of evidence, the forensic report, like everything that you would gather to sort of submit in a legal process, let's say. I think there's something in addition that's beyond that isn't quite contained there. And I find that film and that poetry and other forms of art can be this sort of like a vessel, a ship that you can climb into and travel to this space of questioning, of honoring, of connection. For me, when I'm inside of a poem, I know either as a reader or as an author, there's a kind of event that takes place inside of me. I know it's a little trite, but it's sort of like a window suddenly opens and suddenly you're looking at the world with sort of like maybe a slightly different light shining that's hitting the angles differently, maybe a new vantage point, or there's something fluttering along the edge that suddenly becomes really important to you that wasn't grabbing your attention before. And that little thing could become quite significant and quite large inside of your consciousness. And yeah, I think that all has to do with why I wanted to write this book. At the time when I was writing quite a few of the poems that ended up being in this book, I was also working on a solitary confinement report for DCIP, which was looking at, what was happening to Palestinian children who were getting this more severe situation, who hadn't confessed, who had been sort of pushed into solitary confinement situations to continue this coercive pressure to get them to produce a confession. And as you're kind of going through and like marking violations and categorizing cases in different ways, I was thinking about what kinds of incidents connected to another story I had read in the news or another child's case that I had worked on. I was thinking about what parts of their experience were like living and breathing and what parts were sort of falling through the cracks. And also my own experiences as a Palestinian American, whether in my time here in the US or in Jerusalem, and the different ways that I've sort of been erased or that I've resisted a form of erasure, and how sometimes like my form of response is structural and sometimes it's really small and personal. And how like all these different things, all those things have something to do with like what's the state of our consciousness in the US toward Palestinian speech. What kind of speech are Palestinians allowed to have and when, and what can we say about what they say, what we say, and what's being written out, what's being written off. So during the rest of my time with you, I'm going to be kind of like weaving in and out between the facts and the figures, between the kind of, nonfiction, let's say, and between the art. I hope that you'll end up in a place a little bit different than where you began today, a little bit sort of seeing the light maybe hit the story in a new way. I'll just tell you a little bit about, I'll show you my book real quick. This is Paper and Stick. You have this sort of disappearing man on the cover. And a lot of the poems that you're going to hear today include fragments of children's testimonies. And I want to clarify that those have been used after the families gave permission for the testimonies to be used for advocacy purposes, and with DCIP's permission as well, since they were the ones who collected those statements. And this next poem also has some text from the military order, Order 101, which is an order that sort of has loomed large in my mind and in my life. It's called the Order Regarding Prohibition of Incitement and Hostile Propaganda Actions. Quite a title. And it's an order that does not recognize the right to demonstrate, and it prohibits different kinds of speech and different kinds of gatherings. So it feels really relevant, not only to my life, to the act of writing this book, but also to Obaida's life. So the poem is called Order Number 101. Print, blown up the front door, and printing, including lithography. Captain Aziz on the phone, that my mouth would get stuck to the wall. Writing on a typewriter, duplication, photography, recording, filming, and sat a dog on my feet I saw everything. Any other way to describe or copy words, literature as a human shield. Signs were too tight. Pictures, maps, drawings, decorations, films, voices, sounds, similar to the door of a safe, and other such material. When we're talking about military orders and military law, you have to understand that Israel is operating these two completely separate legal systems in the West Bank. There's military law with its severe restrictions on daily life, such as, movement restrictions, which is only applying to Palestinians. Meanwhile, Israeli settlers who are also living illegally in the West Bank fall under the much more protective Israeli civilian law. Throughout the West Bank, you're going to see Israeli soldiers, police, you're going to see private security firms, settler guards that are all enforcing this restrictive, punishing military law and protecting this, much smaller Israeli settler population at the expense of the Palestinian civilians. So against this hyper-militarized backdrop, Palestinians, including children, are facing, a disproportionate amount of violence, of restricted access to education, all kinds of things. And of course, the result is being exposed to psychological trauma. Plastic soldiers. What if every desire in your life had a checkpoint manned by tiny green soldiers, poured on a factory line that began with a giant bath of toxic swirls, cooled in batches into predetermined postures, some leaning forward into an enemy that is open-ended for you to provide, some standing perfectly erect, fused to a gun that will elongate, not snap if chewed. For simple agendas, Jaffa oranges, a trip to the sea, a single figure will do. For more serious pursuits, a selfie on Le Salève, lunch with your cousin, allow yourself some decades, or begin training a seabird who may yet pass the plastic in its belly. When it comes to the topic of Palestinian children who are under military detention, I can't overstate enough how much it has to do with these systematic and routine abuses. It's not a question of, a soldier acting out of line or a bad apple, quote unquote. It's about these patterns that are pretty stable and predictable over long periods of time. In the West Bank, Palestinian children, usually boys, are being prosecuted and detained within the system that denies them even the most basic of rights. Israel has this, we say this dubious distinction of being the only country in the whole world that is systematically prosecuting between 500 and 700 children every year in the military courts. And what we mean by that is children may show up here and there in a military court in unusual circumstances in other countries. But, for Israel, this is the only way that Palestinian children in the West Bank are going to be prosecuted because they live under military law. So if they're arrested by Israeli forces, the only legal framework available to them is a military framework. Most of these children are going to be detained in the, more than half are going to be detained in the middle of the night. There's typically a dozen or so soldiers that surround the house to kind of secure the perimeter, and then others enter the house. Children may wake up in their bed finding a soldier pointing their machine gun right at them. And, this is where the trauma begins, like realizing that people that you counted on for your safety while you slept, whether it's your parents or whether it's the structure of your house or your deadbolt or the walls of your bedroom, like that none of these have any power to offer you safety, to provide a safe place for you to grow. Soldiers will typically ransack the house and gather all of the residents into one room, photograph them, take down their information, including all the children. And if a parent intervenes and tries to protect their child in some way, whether from being assaulted or from being arrested or, even just wanting them to stay asleep in their bed, soldiers can verbally assault them or physically assault them or even arrest other members of the family. Soldiers very rarely tell the parents of the reason for the arrest or even where the child that they arrest is going to be taken while they're being questioned. Most children, just as you saw in the film with Obaida, are blindfolded and then had their wrists bound with plastic cords, not handcuffs. Handcuffs are actually more protective because they're, made out of a mold and they're metal. There's like a preserved space around the wrist. But plastic ties are flexible. You can tighten them as much as you want. And like in the story of Obaida, there's a number of children who are bound with just one plastic cord instead of Israel's own regulations, which require 3. So 3 would kind of mimic handcuffs. You'd have like 1, 2, and then 1 linking in the middle. So you could at least move a little bit. But Obaida had his wrists behind his back with just a single plastic cord, which gives a lot of sort of possibility of them being too tight or cutting off blood flow to the wrists. Soldiers then typically place the child in a military jeep, blindfolded and often on the floor of the metal truck. And during this first 24 to 48 hours, 3 out of 4 children who are under military detention will experience some kind of physical violence. Interrogate the breaks. They blindfolded me and did the same to Montasser. There skipped stops, hesitations, cardiacs. Tied my hands behind my back with my own belt. Insomnias of heat. Aerial police station. The dropped phrase, where the named. Strip searched me. Then they re-buried, check the usual place, tied and re-blindfolded me. Under the skin, the liquid forms a pocket. At first, there were 4 of them. The splinter may dissolve in time. That was the last time I saw Montasser. Into the tissue A. Temperature was controlled manually. The cell was so cold. Policy to extract every foreign. I could not close my eyes. Body, be sure, the blade clean. I confess to the accusations made against me. Nearly all of the Palestinian children under Israeli military detention will be interrogated without the presence of a lawyer or a family member, despite the fact that they are minors. In fact, they don't even, have this right on paper to have an adult or a family member or a lawyer present during the interrogation. They only have the right to speak to a lawyer briefly. Usually it takes place over the phone before the interrogation. The interrogations are coercive, using a wide range of tactics such as threats, intimidation, verbal abuse, being confronted with statements that are typed up in Hebrew rather than Arabic, so they're not sure what it says. being exposed to informants, all in order to elicit some kind of a confession. In the worst instances during interrogation, children might be subjected to physical violence, to position abuse. And there we're talking about sort of altered chairs made to be very painful, that they're forced to sit in for long periods, tied up in ways that make it very difficult, very painful and difficult to concentrate. Solitary confinement, and other forms of physical or psychological pressure, which amount to torture under international law. White, excuse me, white Kia. What happened to me was a mouth. White Kia pulled over. Inside a wave curl, a common gnaw. Kidnapped us without saying a word. My ribs, prayer in its cavity, had their handguns, bowels of clam and merman. Threw us into the trunk, sink all bubbles into the illustration. Felt my body was breaking. The list of unknowns long. They took us like lanternfish that dark away with their tiny lights. A mattress that had not seen the sun. Each day my commune with the whale refused me water. Its wants appear, forays of sudden color. Just because I called Abu Amir a rat, we ask what we are in common denominators. My friends who confessed against me, what of us? Almost everyone confesses, and almost everyone is handed a guilty verdict. Once the child confesses and is charged, they're moved into the juvenile section of a prison, and typically their detention conditions improve. However, even these places lack this basic rehabilitative framework that should be used for children whenever they're deprived of their liberty. And we see a really stark difference between the Israeli juvenile detention centers meant for Israeli youth and the military prison juvenile sections for Palestinian youth. So in an Israeli juvenile detention center, you have sports programs, you have opportunities to leave the detention center and go into the community and participate in something like soccer. You have a full art program, an educational program, specialized therapeutic services, highly trained staff. There's things like petting zoos, even access to sort of the most cutting edge, let's say, thinking around how do we help a child re-enter society. And that's as it should be. But for Palestinian detainees who are children, it's completely different. For the most part, there's nothing to do besides watch TV. They're not allowed to leave their room very much. Education is really, really limited to just sort of a very bare bones approach, of a couple of subjects like Arabic and Hebrew, and most other subjects are deemed to be a security risk for the children to learn. And so with very little access to education and with spending 18 to 20 hours each day inside of a cell, children who have been detained like that for any number of months are going to leave that situation behind in their schools, and sort of with a changed social perspective, which is something we could maybe identify with a tiny bit after the pandemic of what a year like this has done to us. Imagine for a child being detained that way, what it's going to look like when he has to re-enter society and get back to the books and deadlines and friendships. So a lot of kids afterwards continue to act as if they're still in prison, self-isolating, just watching TV all day and disengaging with life, which is again, one of the things that made Obaida really stand out to me. So again, just to reiterate this point, we're not talking about a basically good and just system with a few bad apples and a few, places where it went wrong. We're talking about a system that's really not designed for justice, that's certainly not designed for children, for children's rights, let's say, and not designed for rehabilitation. It's really designed as a means of control, of controlling people's speech and ideas and controlling them through fear, the fear of what's going to happen to a family if they speak out in any way. So in this way, the military detention of minors really mirrors many of Israel's other occupation structures and practices. And yet, caught in this system, as Sarah was, highlighting, we have to remember there's also individuals. There are medics and chefs, teachers, dabka dancers, neighbors, children, and Obaida. He was only 14 years old when he was first arrested in 2017. And as, my friend, his former lawyer, Farah Bayatsi, said in an interview following his death, he was such a small boy facing such a big system. And it's a system that is not designed to protect him or the Palestinian community that he comes from. It's a system that is inherently stacked against him from the get-go, that does not provide children those minimum safeguards that are required by international law. And, as we said, it's a system that ultimately finds the overwhelming majority of children guilty of some crime, even if internally they continue to maintain their innocence. I'll end with one more poem here. It's called Hand That Rings. My father has been missing for 13 years. One herniation of spine, one language of lumbering. No one knows anything about anything. On the stair, one father, one untranslatable rasp. I finished the 9th grade, worked at a car wash. They were all masked, one stale plate left for rights. His forehead bled massively. One hand that rings and rocks, rinses, readies. An Arab soldier asked me where I hid my weapon. One earth to shovel, no. They stayed for about 2 hours and terrorized. More than this, ache of shovel, of boot, debased, of record. It was raining and I was needleless, discounted, corroded song. So I'm going to just share with you the link for this chapbook. I really appreciate this chance to share many poems with you. As Sarah said, this chapbook is not out yet. It's out next month. So if you do go ahead and click on this link and check it out, it wouldn't get to you right away. It would be in a couple weeks. You'd be in that first batch to receive it. And, I really hope it's a way of telling the story, a way of passing the light and continuing the good work towards justice for all of us.
I really appreciate all of the poetry and the wisdom and words and insight you've shared, Priscilla. That for me is really powerful. And I was listening. I mean, there are so many pieces to follow up on, from whose voices we pay attention to the lack of security if you're arrested at night at home in your bed where you should be safe. But what I kept coming back to again and again are just, the kids I've worked with or the teenagers I've worked with in various capacities in my life, and how unfathomable it is that that would ever happen to them. And I think the piece that I come back to, and I'm realizing, as I was listening to you, why the No Way to Treat a Child campaign is called No Way to Treat a Child, because that was just the refrain that was going through my head. That's no way to treat a child, irrespective of any political context, irrespective of any bigger concerns. It's no way to treat a child that provides no peace, security, dignity, comfort, freedom for them. So I'm wondering if you'd be able to say, we'll talk more about this in our next webinar next week that I'll invite you all back to in a few minutes. But I'm wondering if you could talk, Priscilla, about where you find hope in this work and some of the opportunity to respond for us in a way that is productive and tries to address these concerns, because it can be really helpful. But at the same time, as we see the world the way it is, we also see opportunities to act as peacemakers.
Yeah, I mean, everything you said, absolutely. I think hope comes from each other often. Like, it's just as you go home and you see your family and they encourage you and they say, "Oh, get back out there and we love you." It's the same kind of thing. It's when I see somebody acting in courage or acting in what I call like that light, passing the light, it encourages me. It's like you receive it and you say, okay, well, if they could speak out in courage, like what's my act? What's the thing that I could do that's right before me today, to kind of like keep it going and pass it on to the next person. And as much as that sounds like something from a movie, I really find that to be true. Every time that I share space with somebody that is acting toward justice, it helps me kind of enter that vision and sort of step toward that same expectation of love, of hope, of our common human dignity. And I think oftentimes the things that are so horrible that we hear in the world are not as many as we perceive them to be. There's actually a lot of people who are standing for what's right and what's fair, but are maybe not as loud. And so some of it, I think, is about us each having the courage to publicly be in our truth.
That's really, really powerful. If anyone has any questions for Priscilla, we've got just a couple minutes left, but if you want to put them in the chat, this is your chance to ask her about her work, her poetry, anything she said about child detention today. We've got time for a couple of questions. Otherwise, I'm wondering, Priscilla, if you can say just a couple more words about, you touched on this earlier, but this is something that affects not just children, but families and all of society. How is this an issue that really touches kind of every strata of Palestinian life and society in a way that, targets the most vulnerable, but has an implication for everybody?
Yeah, I mean, I think Order 101 is a good thing to kind of sit with. I'm gonna drop Betsalem's translation of it here. When you have a kind of seminal military order like hanging over your life like this, it's very sober, right? To think like all of these things are illegal, all of those things, put me at risk. And it was something that, like, when I was living in Jerusalem, like, was affecting daily life. People were arrested for just wearing the colors of the flag, the Palestinian flag. People were arrested for, even people who were, like, let's say, deeply apolitical could be arrested for something sort of like random, like being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And so there's this constant fear that's being kind of used to like activate you towards one posture or another, to say, like, if you do this, or if you're seen with this person, or if you're thought of in this way, you could be arrested at any time, and you could sort of like fall off the cliff in terms of what your overall life looks like. And that's a very scary thing. If you're a parent in here, that's a very terrifying thing to think about once you hold that responsibility of, as a parent, or the idea of these kinds of things happening to your own child, can really motivate people to stay quiet as much as possible, or to just sort of go along with the wrong things that are happening around you. And yet Palestinian society has this very, very rich tradition of resistance. And I think without it, we would all be gone by now. It's a kind of understanding that you're going to die if you don't do something about your own erasure. And I think it's also why there's been a rich history of international solidarity and sort of saying like, well, these two things are alike, like police violence against Black people in the US looks a lot like, an Israeli soldier shooting a child in the back after a protest has already ended, as happened with the Nakba killings. So you have this opportunity for incredible connection, incredible, solidarity that's happening at the same time as this incredible pressure to sort of disappear is taking place.
I really appreciate that note of solidarity, and it makes me think of another one of our principles and practices, which is own our agency and responsibility, that looks at the fact that we all have agency. We have the opportunity to react to the injustice we see in the world, and we have a responsibility to respond in ways that further peace and peacemaking. And so for me, child detention is one of those key issues. I mentioned mutual flourishing at the beginning, where we're working for freedom, dignity, and security for Palestinians and Israelis. This is a really clear instance where there is not freedom, dignity, or security, especially for Palestinian children. So I'd invite everybody on this call today to not only come back next week on the 28th at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time to join us for part 2 of this webinar series with Detention for Children International and the American Friends Service Committee, but to spend some more time thinking about what this means in your life in terms of owning your agency and responsibility, and reacting to what Priscilla has shared today, which is incredibly heavy, but also shows us where we can get active as peacemakers and can find opportunities to work to bring about a more just and peaceful future that we want to see. So I think David put in the chat the link to sign up for next week's webinar. We'd love to have you there. We'll get more into some ongoing campaigns, including the No Way to Treat a Child campaign that offers some really concrete ways to take action on this issue and to work to defend the rights of Palestinian children and try and end the psychological violence and harm that comes from child detention, alongside the very real physical and direct violence and harm. So Priscilla, is there anything else you'd like to say before we close?
I think all of you just being here is so important. It's a sign that things have already moved inside of you, and you are already acting towards your conscience. And thank you for the courage you give me, for the attention and space inside your life you're giving to this issue. And, please feel free to find me on Facebook or Twitter or whatever, if you have particular ways that you want to, if you need me to give you some courage for the day, or if you want to give me some, I would love that.
Well, thanks so much, Priscilla. I know it's not easy to talk about this, and you shared about, the facts and the stories so beautifully and poetically and really powerfully. And I think everybody else who came and joined the conversation today is listeners and are hopefully moved by this and will come and join us again next week. We'd love to have you continue engaging this conversation and looking into ways to get active. So thanks so much for spending the past hour with us, and we will hopefully see you all again soon.
Thank you so much.